Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and today's episode is called Worlds at War Over Earth. This is chapter 7 of Prometheus and Atlas by Jason, Reza, Shore, Johnny. Now, you may notice that I'm a little tiny today, and that's only because this chapter is really hard, and I wanted to make myself smaller in order so that you can see the visual aids better. Okay, I usually make really pretty AI art, right? But the AI art in this episode is more about explaining what's in the written text. So you'll notice on one side I have summary of the written text, and then on the other side with the AI art, I have a visual with some words on it, some written text. I usually avoid that, but I had to do it this way because this chapter is pretty challenging. And so I wanted you, the viewer, to have two different ways to interact with the video and learn the material. So you have my voice, you have this written text, these bullet points, and then you have the AI art, which blends the two in a way, right? Now, uh, as I read this chapter, this is what I understand, okay? And I am going to convey that to you the best I can. Okay. Now, Heidegger, Jason uses Heidegger to start with the problem. And the problem is this, that technology, technoscience, has a way of forming us just as much or more so than we do of forming it. Okay. Now you can see this in the technologizing of the human body, right? We talk about the brain as a computer, we talk about the heart as a pump. We talk about the stomach as an engine, perhaps, right? Um, and we didn't do this because in antiquity there were no computers, right? Maybe there were some rudimentary pumps, perhaps. Um, but if you look at also our social interactions, right? What we used to call friends and family, what we used to call, making friends, rubbing shoulders. Now we call networks, right? It used to be friends and family. Now we call them networks, right? Why? Because now we have computer networks, and we have this tendency of seeing ourselves as nodes in these networks, right? Now, this in and of itself isn't terrible because technology reveals nature to be technological, but it has the capacity, the potential to dehumanize us and lead us down a path we don't want to go, where each of us becomes nothing more than another brick in the wall, as Pink Floyd put it, right? We all have the potential of becoming just another brick in the wall, another cog in the machine, another node in the network. And that's a problem, right? That's a problem. And in this chapter, uh, Jason goes arm in arm with Heidegger and Nietzsche to help us find the solution to that problem. And this is what it's about. Okay. Now, Heidegger looked at technology and art as having a common root, and that common root is poetry. Now, poetry, he defines it as something much more than just the haiku or iambic pentameter, right? Heidegger goes back to the very root of the word poesis, which is Greek and means bringing forth or creation. Now, this is interesting, right? Because as we've learned in our previous chapters, specifically with Schelling, the artist and the scientist both in the groundbreaking genius ones at least both draw upon these aesthetic ideals, right? These this knowledge bank from a transcendent source to do what they do. And so poetry is the same way, right? People write love poems when they're in love, right? um and poetry in all its forms, some poetry rhymes, some doesn't, right? Some poetry, the kind that doesn't rhyme, like chiasmus, has a very specific structure to it, right? And we see that also in architecture, right? In architecture, patterns repeat themselves, right? Just like they do in poetry. Um, we can be moved by the beauty of a certain kind of machine, just as we are the beauty of a poem or a work of art, right? So this broader kind of poetic way of thinking is what undergirds technology and art for Heidegger. Now, the difference between technology and art is that, or specifically tools in art, um, is that tools are seen as strictly useful, right? And their createdness, their existence as a kind of art is lost in our use of them, right? So right now I'm using a computer with a camera. Um, this in itself, this machine I'm using is very much a form of art, and it is something that was created, that was came from someone's imagination and while planning, just as any kind of painting would, right? But the fact that gets lost, right? If I'm not self-aware, if I'm not self-aware enough by reading philosophy, that gets easily lost, right? And the in art, on the other hand, it's seen as something that is not useful, right? You don't get a painting and use it to shovel the earth, right? But nevertheless, it art reveals things. It brings forth uh, things about our world. Now, this is where we get into the concept of Dasein and the world, right? As I've said in other episodes, Dasein literally being there. You are a Dasein. I am a Dasein, right? There is the earth, which is this objective reality that we all share, but the earth is not the same as the world. The world is that place, time, um, where everything I think, say, and do makes sense, right? And so all worlds are bounded by what a historical horizon, right? So the horizon of, as you know, is as far as you can see until the Earth touches the sky, right? That line where the Earth touches the sky is as far as you can see. That's the horizon, and every culture has a horizon. Every culture, every world has a set of knowledge that includes things that are known and excludes things that are unknown, right? Things that are believed and things that are not believed, right? And so every culture is defined by this kind of historical horizon that both reveals and conceals truth, right? And becomes kind of uh, the whole basis for the interpretive nature of our lives, right? Um, Now, Nietzsche argues that life and creativity depend on being grounded on a horizon. So this is a lot like what we talked about in our last episode with Bernardo Kastrup and Jason Rezajani when we talked about, you know, the interface theory of perception, right? Um, every we need a horizon, this limit to what we know and a forgetting of past knowledge in order to stay alive, right? Because there is such a thing for in a world, for a people, for a culture, there is such a thing as useless information, or maybe information that is depressing and detrimental to their well-being, right? So every culture has needs this horizon to stay alive in the environment in which it lives, right? So there's certain things the Bedouin needs to know that the Amazonian Indian doesn't need to know. There's a certain way the Viking has to view the world versus the way, let's say, a modern San Franciscoite needs to see the world in order to survive in both of those worlds. Because in the world of the Viking, let's say, uh, killing the man that killed my father makes perfect sense. In the world of the San Franciscan, killing the man that killed my father is going to put me in jail for a very long time, and it doesn't make sense, right? Um, as much. So Nietzsche argues that life and creativity depend on being bounded by a horizon, right? Because there is such a thing as useless information. There is such a thing as bad news, right? That would keep a people from progressing, anybody from progressing and having the optimism needed to push forward. There is such a thing as uh, information that's useless, right? So, for example, an Amazonian Indian doesn't need to know how to survive in the desert. Bedouin does, right? And vice versa, right? So for a Bedouin to learn all the skills and all the lore of the Amazonian Indian is a waste of time, and vice versa, right? So there is such a thing as useless information. So every organism and every society has to have a treasure trove of information that's useful to their survival and a story that's uplifting and elevating that'll give them the hope they need in order to press forward, right? And Heidegger builds on this by asserting that every form of art is a representation of this horizon, right? Of a culture's horizon. And the minute tools appear in a museum as artwork, that represents that the obsolescence of that former culture's horizon of their worldview, right? So because if I were to find, let's say, a helmet from ancient Greece, right, at a museum, like let's say the British Museum, right, they have a helmet from ancient Greece. That helmet might still be able to protect somebody's head, right, from a blow, right? But because we don't use it anymore, right, and now it's become this form of artwork, right? It's become a museum piece, and that's representative of the fact that the world in which it came out of no longer exists, and the attendant worldview of the people that built it is now obsolete, or at least it's obsolete today in the form it actually existed in the past. That doesn't mean we can't mine those old worldviews for our own modern day. It just means that that specific worldview, the environment, the culture it was produced in, no longer exists, right? So great creators, especially the tragic poets, they're the ones that discover the existence of their people, like the being of their people, and the art is always just a little bit ahead of where the people are, right? And this in itself extends the horizon of the possibility for that people and inspires them to do more things and go further beyond, right? And it makes them and this kind of art, this inspiration they gain from it, right? Um, it frames the world for them in such a way that they are no longer just human beings. They're no longer just hairless monkeys trying to survive in their environment, right? They become something more, right? And so um, this is where the concept of world war comes from, right? So different cultures are going to have different worldviews. And when they fight, that is a war for the worldview, a literal world war. So we're not just talking about World War One and World War Two, which are called world wars because the whole world was involved. No, the Spanish versus the Aztecs was a world war, right? You had two different worlds at war with each other for the worldview. In the Spanish one, and as a result, all the Mexicans are Catholic now. And, Mexico arguably is a Western culture, right? With Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian values, as Giorgio Meloni would say, right? And so that's why art is so important, right? Because it helps it helps create the world, right, for that culture, as opposed to having them simply live in an earth, right? And so for Heidegger, also, truth is aletheia, and I've in this show I've described aletheia as kind of like the sexy lady doing the dance of the seven veils, right? The veils keep coming up, but you never see her naked, right? That is to say that truth is a continual unveiling. We never reach the bottom of the pit, so to speak. We never arrive at a final truth, right? We never arrive at the end of history. uh, but this aletheia always, even though it's potentially infinitely progressive, always involves some kind of concealment, right? And so there is no stable earth or nature accessible, because there's, again, an infinite number of possible worlds that we can exist in, right? As we gain more and more knowledge. Um, Heidegger even goes deeper than this in saying that, you know, there is no such thing as a purely neutral or value-free science or history. Okay, that history is a form of exploration, right? It's a form of, aletheia maxing, as the youth may say today, right? Um, and that again, there is no neutrality or value-free method. And we've learned this in our earlier chapters when we looked at Foucault and Paul Feyerabend, right? This illusion of neutrality, um, it has a potential to create a science and a history that totally strips the worldview of any illusions or mystique or concealment that is necessary for the people to progress and advance, right? In a healthy way. History is not the work of finding out what happened in the past or finding out what most likely happened in the past, right? Um, History is something we are constantly doing, okay? And actually has its roots in the future more than it does in the past. And that's crazy because we usually think of history as being about the past, but no, it's actually about the future, okay? History is fundamentally future oriented, right? And what that means is that there's, according to Nietzsche, there's three kinds of history. There's monumental history, antiquarian history, and critical history. Okay. Critical history strives to kind of kill all the sacred cows and debunk all the myths, right? It attempts to be objective, um, and, you know, purely, let's say materialistic, let's say, in its description of the past, right? Um, and that's okay if what we're trying to do is destroy bad myths and bad practices, right? Um, but it also has the potential to um, take all the magic and fun out of life, right? And leave everybody with just this boring nuts and bolts kind of a thing that doesn't inspire them. And in fact, turns the culture down to apathy, right? And not just that, but gets the culture to hate itself, right? So you see this, for example, in kind of deconstructions of American history, right? You learn American history one way in elementary school and maybe even high school, and then you go into college and you find out that all the people who were your heroes were actually bad people and did bad things, and that certain things didn't happen the way you were taught by Mrs. Krabappel. And that's all well and good if you're trying to, again, do away with bad customs and bad traditions. But if you do that too much, you end up getting in a place where people become apathetic about their country and their culture and their way of life. And then you end up like the Europeans that just kind of take everyone in at the expense of their own. And, they risk, you know, subjugation or radical, let's say, disappearance as Europeans as we know them, right? You also have the antiquarian mode of history, which is the exact opposite of what I described, right? It describes the past, but it does so in a way that sees it as a golden age. And so conservative thinkers will often take this mode in doing history. And that's why they want change to happen as slow as possible, because the more things change, the less they become like that glorified past. But there's monumental history, and monumental history is revolutionary and future oriented, right? Revolutionary history starts not with what happened in the past, but what do we want the future to be like? Where do you want to be in 5 years or 10 years, like, they used to tell you in high school, right? But doing this with a society, right? With a nation. with a race. Okay. Where do we want to be 100 years from now? Well, if we want to be on Mars or on the moon or on, the moons of Jupiter or at the asteroid belt, then we need to start telling a story about our past, which which points to that future state, right? And or whatever it is, if you want to, live in an Islamic caliphate, then you have to tell a story about, let's say, the Islamic past, which shows that as something that is once more an inevitable reality, and that it's, better, and that everything is trending in that direction. You name it, whatever you want the future to be, you have to tell the story of the past in such a way that points to that future. And this story of the past necessarily will leave out details which run counter to that program. And it will necessarily mythologize or expand and exaggerate, or put undue focus on the aspects of the past which necessarily point to that end goal that you want, right? So this is what monumental history is. Um, and you can see this today. Like, look at the state of Israel. I don't care what your politics are, right? But why did the Jewish people, okay, led by Ashkenazi Jews, build a state in that specific piece of land? Well, it's because in their mythic history, right? That's where they came from, right? And why did it happen right after the Holocaust? Well, in their mythic history, right? They, fled one land and went to that specific land after slavery, right? And who can argue with the fact that during the Holocaust, at least in the camps, they were slaves, right? So these kind of myths, right? Whether or not they're historically true, whether or not they're physically true, whether or not they actually happen the way they're written, are the kinds of things that inspire action toward an eventual goal in a nation or people, right? And so for Nietzsche, we shouldn't just do history to find out what happened in the past, but we should create for ourselves an origin that we wish we actually came from, right? Now, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but Heidegger, one of the things he talks about is how, we have an authentic temporality, right? And the most natural way of telling time is by the sun. It goes up, it goes down, right? In our own circadian rhythms, right? you know, we wake up when the sun gets up, and then, we're at our most energetic right in the middle of the day doing our work, and right when the sun's up in the middle of the sky, and just as the sun comes down, we also get sleepy because that's when we sleep, when everything's dark. And that's how people used to kind of tell time, right? But with clocks, right? Now we turn time into something that exists in units, right? And so we naturally see the world as something that exists in units, and then we naturally see ourselves as something that exists in units. And being is inseparable from time. Time is our being, right? Being toward the future. Okay. And so technology changes time, the nature of time, and so changes our own nature, or at least how we see ourselves, right? Which goes back to what I was saying about Nietzsche, that for Nietzsche, we need to, again, give ourselves a past that we would rather have originated from, okay? And we do this by um, purposeful forgetfulness, right? In bounded horizons. So, an example of this is, again, in the United States. The oldest American city within the continuous 48 is San Augustine, Florida. Okay. The third oldest American city, if I'm not mistaken, is Santa Fe, New Mexico. Jamestown is the second oldest city. Okay. So you have San Augustine, Florida, oldest. Second oldest, Jamestown. Third oldest, Santa Fe, New Mexico. The oldest was founded by the Spanish. The third oldest was founded by the Spanish. The second oldest was founded by British. So, but when we learn about American history, we don't learn about the Spanish settling Florida or the Spanish settling New Mexico. No, we start with the Pilgrims. Okay. That's an example of this purposeful forgetfulness, right? And there's nothing wrong with this. It's a matter of focus, right? So we tell the story of the Pilgrims, right? And then we tell a story of the American Revolution and the westward expansion, all that good stuff, right? But that's not the only way to tell American history. But we do it that way because we need to in order to justify the society in which we live, our form of government, our language, and our goals, right? It's no surprise that the nation that had an origin story of people crossing the ocean in a boat and then crossing the continent by handcart, let's say, were also the people that crossed space to land on the moon, right? And it's also no mystery that the Russians also have a myth of eastward expansion, right? You have the Kievan Rus, these Russians that land in Kiev, and they found that nation, and then they end up forming Russia. And long story short, they eventually go all the way east to Alaska, and that same culture cross space just vertically, right? So we need to tell these kind of stories because you have an end goal of where you want to be, the kind of people you want to be, the kind of society you want to have. So you tell a story that says, you know, the protos is the same as the telos, right? That our past was just like where we want to be, right? And then everything we do in the middle, okay, connects these 2 points in time, right? And so that's why, we history we do this whether we're conscious of it or not, right? Um, So this is where we get into Heidegger, right? In his final interview for Der Spiegel, and then it was an interview that was only published after he died. He gave his own personal explanation for his support of National Socialism and what that was all about, right? So in the popular mind, we think of National Socialism as simply being really mean or loving people with blue eyes and blonde hair and everyone else is bad, right? Um, and hating Jews, okay? And to a certain extent, that's all true. Um, but there was something deeper going on there for Heidegger, and it was the attempt to confront the essence of planetary technology. And what does that mean? So once upon a time, in pre-modern times, you had all these different worlds, right? You had the world of Edo, Japan. You had the world of the Maasai. You had the Islamic world. You had, the world of the Maya, right? You had the Western European world. Okay. You had all these different worlds, and all these different worlds had different kinds of technology, right? They had different techniques and different technologies for all sorts of things, right? Whether it be making food or meditation, prayer, or architecture, you name it. And all these different people who lived in these worlds would only learn so much about their world and what they needed to know in order to survive in their world, and their knowledge base was limited to their world, right? And it was very different from all the other worlds, right? But with television and radio and the internet and AI, with planes, trains, and automobile, all of these worlds just become eviscerated, okay, or emaciated, or convergent with each other. Okay, and this causes an uprooting of peoples, uh, mentally and physically, right? There's no coincidence that mass migration coincides with, you know, uh, the advent of modern technology, not just in capability, but in this illusion or maybe it's not an illusion, right? Because we have this world horizon now, such that you know, you know, crossing from Africa to Europe is seen as no different than crossing from Portugal to Russia in the minds of many, because we do have, in some sense, this monoculture. And the monoculture literally uproots people and gets them moving. It's how I live in Japan, right? This endangers Aletheia, right? This endangers truth as concealment, right? Because now nothing is concealed and there's nothing left to discover in or this is what people would naturally assume in this situation. And so the philosopher's task for Heidegger is to make people self-aware of technosciences colonizing of their world, right? To make the people aware of the fact that they are being molded by technoscience just as much as, or even more so, their molding of technoscience, right? They're being molded by just as much or more so than they do the molding of technoscience, right? And the way you would do this is through an archaeofuturism, right? You would look to the deep roots of European thought, which is ancient Greece, right? And so, and so as to act as an anchor, so as to allow us to be self-aware enough to understand what's happening with us vis-a-vis technology. And Germany, for Heidegger, was in a very unique place to do that, because at the time of World War II, Germany was not only the most technologically sophisticated country in the world, but they were also the deepest engagers with the West's Hellenic roots, right? They were the ones who were engaging most deeply with the thought of ancient Greece, while at the same time they were engaging with technological advancement that was surpassing everybody else's. So for Heidegger, it was is the task of Germany, the burden of Germany, to take the reins of technoscience, to be self-aware enough of technoscience's influence upon humanity, so as to take the reins of it and shape technoscience and indirectly humanity through it in a certain trajectory that was positive, let's say. Um, and this requires that kind of poetic thinking, right? That understanding that art and technology have their roots in poesis, right? And in doing this, uh, we become aware of um, how we're being moved by it. And so for Heidegger, only a God can save us at this point, right? Technology is just destroying worlds left and right. Not Earth, but destroying worlds left and right and uprooting peoples and causing all kinds of havoc. So only a God can save us, right? And so the question is which gods? Okay. And for Giorgiani, this is Prometheus and Atlas. Prometheus and Atlas as the Greek instantiations of these aesthetic ideals. Okay. Prometheus representing the inventor, the technologist, the artisan, the craftsman, right? The creator of new technology, which then enframes the world in new ways. And Atlas, right? As in Atlas, like a map. You have Atlas, the Titan that literally holds the world on his shoulders, but then you also have Atlas, as in a map of the world, right? And what is an atlas if not like a modeling of the world, right? So it's Prometheus and Atlas represent our taking responsibility for modeling our own world in a way that's beneficial to us. And this is where he gets into Bergson, where Bergson sees the universe as a God making machine, and that the universe exists for the purpose of creating man, not as we are now, but as we may become as gods, as supermen. So we go back to our previous chapters where Bergson talks about, well, we have Schelling, and then we start with Schelling, and then we go into Bergson, where he talks about how um, we have this hyper intellectual psychology, right? That, but a very diminished intuition, right? So this hyper intellectual psychology allows us to make rockets and the internet and do all sorts of great things. But we have a diminished intuition, right? Our telepathy is weak, right? Our clairvoyance is weak. Um, and what Giorgiani through Bergson argues is that we need to get back to that fork in the road between intellect and intuition, and willingly, self-awarely um, bring back our intuition so that it can be at parity with our intellect, which will then in turn allow us to be more creative with our technology and art, and also more powerful, which is what we're supposed to be. And in doing this, we embody the archetypes of Prometheus and Atlas. Okay. Because an increased intuition, psychic intuition, okay, the kind of intuition you would increase intuition, you would need to be telepathic, and functionally clairvoyant. That's the same kind of increased intuition that we would need to develop the technologies we need to develop in order to, you know, travel faster than light, or have lifespans of 500 years. Okay, the kind of technological leaps we need to make to be the gods we were meant to be requires a leap in intuition equal to the leap of intuition needed to be functionally telepathic and functionally clairvoyant. Okay, this kind of creativity and this kind of psychic functioning go hand in hand. Okay, and so we need to tell a better story about our past that will allow us to reach that future state. And we need to do it by being conscious of an intentional ignorance of those aspects of our history that are not positive, that are not powerful, that are not spectral, right? And we need to do this consciously, to consciously emphasize those aspects of our history which are powerful, which are positive, and which are spectral. And if we do that, we can walk into a future that is spectral, that is positive, and that is powerful. Okay. And so that's chapter 7 of Prometheus and Atlas. And I know I struggled through this because it is hard to explain, but it's easier to understand if you actually read the book like I did and read my handy notes. So, just to sum it all up, we have a problem. We are being formed by technology uh, to the same degree we form technology, if not more so. And this has the potential of dehumanizing us. Okay. And I mean, if you think the Matrix was really about that, whoa, man, trippy, the spoon's not real. No, 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 no. The Matrix was about human beings reduced to the role of battery. That's what the Matrix was about. Okay. Or at least for me, it was kind of Heidegger on the silver screen, right? Um, and so, how do we avoid this kind of fate where we are formed by technology and used by technology rather than being consciously forming technology and consciously using technology? Well, we need to think with the end in mind. We need to think of what we want to be. Okay. And this has everything to do with the UFO phenomenon, right? Because those others, okay, those non-human intelligences, as the nomenclature goes nowadays, um, are gods or supermen, right? They're intensely telepathic, and they have warp drive and can do things we can't yet. Okay, so we need to have a vision of being like them or better, to being where they are or more so. And that's where history starts. It starts in that future vision of where we want to be. Okay. And once we've determined that, whether knowingly or unknowingly, what we do is create art that expresses that vision and expresses uh description of the world we live in and the world we came from. Okay. And this art then becomes the thing that future people protect, right? And preserve and pass on. Okay. And so, in other words, in order to have that future world, we need to create it today, and we need to have a past, a mythic past that we ourselves create. In other words, to create the future, you have to create the past. To create the future world, you have to create the past world. And in doing that, you create the present world. You create the justification for what you're doing in the present to create that future. Okay. And we need to do this because if we don't, it will be done to us, right? We have no choice other than to do this monumental work of history. Okay. In other words, that is to say, creating a story of the past oriented to a desired future. Because if we don't, we'll either fall into an antiquarian trap or a critical trap. The antiquarian trap will fix the golden age in the past, and then all we're doing is trying to preserve as much of it as we can, because it will be inevitably lost. This is the garbage history and thought of the traditionalists, who says that, you know, the golden age is in the past and we are now in the Kali Yuga, and things will only get worse and worse and worse and worse until it all bottoms out. And then the golden age will return, but not from our agency, the agency of the devas, the agency of the gods. Okay. And this is total nonsense. This is garbage. Okay. This is the philosophy of apathy. And it has a sister which is equally apathetic, and that is the critical history that inevitably always demoralizes and iracinates a people from doing what they need to do to expand and grow and develop and create the way their ancestors did, by criticizing their ancestors, devaluing them, insulting them to the and when they do that, they devalue and demoralize themselves such that they imagine a future for themselves that is one of defeat. And this is seen as something that is morally good because their ancestors were so bad. Now, the only people who have the right to criticize the past are those who are creating a better future. Okay. And we do this first and foremost by being aware of how our being is inextricably connected to our understanding of time. That is to say, that our being is time being. And so by doing this, we need to consciously create a view of time that is positive and progressive so that we can have a positive and progressive future. Okay. Now, as far as I know, someone correct me if I'm wrong, the first to do this were the Iranians, specifically Zoroaster, who rejected the cyclical view of time and replaced it with a linear progressive view of time, which we now find in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But they got it from the Persians. Okay. And as we've seen in previous episodes on this show, the cyclical view of time was also the undoing of the Maya. So we have to be very aware of how technology is forming our view of time and thus forming our view of ourselves. And again, we do this by deciding where we want to be in the future. And that really requires a group of great men and women to lead the people, because the people by themselves won't do it. So you need this small alien elite, so to speak, who will provide a positive, beautiful, powerful future state that we want to be in. And in so doing, creates a history which tells the story that said future state is inevitable if we stay the course. Because in some sense, that is where we come from. Okay. Maybe that can be Atlantis. And this is what National Socialism failed to do, according to Heidegger, right? But nevertheless tried. You know, this is very difficult, but it's important to know because we can learn from the failures of the past. Okay. Technology destroys worlds, not just Earth, but it destroys worlds. It destroys the maps of meaning for peoples and cultures and replaces them with a monoculture, which is a lot less deep and a lot less inspiring and problematic because it literally uproots people. And, we see what's happening today. But even though National Socialism was a catastrophic failure, the one maybe kernel of truth that it had was an archaeofuturism, where the solution to the colonial nature of technoscience, the solution to our possible subjugation to it, by it, comes in rooting ourselves in the deep roots that gave birth to it. And that's why for Heidegger, the Germans saw themselves as the people best able to do that, because at that time they were the technologically most advanced, but they were also the ones who were the deepest engagers with ancient Greek thought. And so we need to actually make that something that's maybe pan-Western, perhaps Eurasian, um, this need to ground ourselves in the deep Greek roots of technology so as to be self aware enough not to allow ourselves to be controlled by it, but make us so that we gain control over it and its trajectory. Okay. And the two guiding lights would have to be Prometheus and Atlas. The myth of the theft of fire, the myth of the world bearer. We need to steal fire. And remember, this is a UFO show, so we need to literally take the fire that was stolen from Olympus. In other words, all this trash retrieval stuff, it needs to be publicized and given to everybody. Oh no, but it's too dangerous. The markets will collapse. Oh my gosh, we could blow up the world. No, no. We got to do it. Okay, that's the only way. Because that's the only way we'll become the gods we were meant to be. And the way we keep the fire from burning us is by also becoming Atlas, by being self aware enough to understand that technology creates new worlds, right? It redefines worldviews. And we need to proactively create a worldview that will allow us to manipulate those technologies rather than being manipulated by them. So whether that's zero point energy or some kind of technet that will enhance psi, whatever it is, we need a positive myth that will allow us to effectively create that future from this recovered technology. Okay. And maybe that's Atlantis. Who knows? But the point is that we have a choice to make, and we need to be aware of uh, storytelling and the power of storytelling and what kind of stories we're telling with an eye toward the future. Because the idea that we can tell stories of the past that are perfectly accurate is total nonsense. And when we even strive to do that, we risk demoralizing ourselves and crippling ourselves. This chapter was hard. So I hope you like it. And I hope you listened at 1.5. But, you should read the book for yourself. And remember always that consciousness is not classified. Good night.